Greetings. I gotta turn this down. Okay, I'm just checking our stuff. Welcome back. You know, the fact that I outweigh you by so much, it makes us look like I'm really in the foreground and you're really in the background. Like,
Oh, I thought you were going to make an intellectual comment.
no, I'm just fat. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm while I'm doing a bunch of things here, making sure that all of our stuff is working. I think that it is. I don't know where you're watching from today. Um, I want to invite you to download our new app and watch us over there because that's where we're going to be monitoring all of our comments and things, trying to aggregate that. So,
Oh, is this playing on the app?
yeah, this is playing
Oh,
on the
okay.
app. So if you've got the app, it looks like that. And so if you've got our app on either iPhone or Android or even Amazon, it's an Android too. So there's two for one. Bunch of weirdo iPhone users. But uh encourage you to do that if you're on Facebook or whatever. And if you're making comments and we don't see them, it's because I'm watching the app and not Facebook. I can't watch everything. Um we've got a difficult topic today. Um Even one that, I mean, Tim and I are very comfortable sparring with one another, I guess, on things that we do and don't agree about. And we don't disagree on this topic. Um, but sometimes we've got to beat it up to get to a certain place. And so that's kind of where we're at on this one. And I wanted to, excuse me, I wanted to address some of what's been going on in the church. Now, Tim, you make a, and when I say the church, I mean the church at large, not any particular congregation. But lately, we've got a string of very prominent church leaders that have resigned. You got Tony Evans, you got Robert Morris is the latest one, Mike Bickle with International House of Prayer. Um,
Hadn't heard that one.
Yep, and is it Bill Hybels? I believe there's another one. There's, and don't quote me on that. I don't want to slander anybody that's not had a problem, but there's just been. Then you've got the release of the Southern Baptist Convention's findings. What was that? A year and a half ago or 2 years ago, whatever that was. I don't know, but there were literally hundreds of covered up. And I'm not even using air quotes because of cover up. It was people. They were covered up, and of abuse and things like that. And what I kind of wanted to run through a little bit today was what brought us here. How do we get to this place in the church? Where do we go from here? And what do we do about now? And how do we go from here? Um, Tim and I tend to sometimes we'll talk in circles, but we really get down to the end of saying the same stuff. We just got to get different words to it. But I wanted to first and foremost, I guess, I think it's extremely important to communicate to anybody that might come across this podcast. Um, if you hear anything that sounds to you like we're making excuses for people's abusive behavior, you've misinterpreted and we've miscommunicated what we're saying. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair.
Um, I hope what you hear is a sympathy and an empathy for the victims of it. But really, what I want to focus our conversation on is how we got here, what do we do, and where we go. Because there, you made a statement a few minutes ago, Tim, as we were coming on, that you're not sure who even knows about all of this stuff that's going on. What makes you say that?
Well, I probably judge some of that from even my own perspective. I used to be real heavy into following, I'll call it church politics. What was going on in the Southern Baptist Convention. And of course, I used to read a whole lot of stuff. And so I knew all these authors that were, I guess they would be considered contemporaries because they're alive and they're doing all this stuff. So I knew about their ministries. And so I was more up on it. So when things like this would happen, I would see it and I would have a response like, if it was somebody else, take Ravi Zachariah, for instance, right? I've been reading and studying that guy for years,
Yeah.
and it comes out that he was I don't even know what the term to use.
He's had a dual life. Just leave it at that.
Well, the fancy term is he had moral turpitude problems.
Yeah.
He was chasing women and doing an ugly life, wasn't telling everybody about it. And so when something like that comes up, you get stunned,
Yeah.
because you're studying and watching and interpreting the kingdom by this guy's training and teaching. And then you find this out and you start going, you can go a lot of different directions, right? It never occurred to me that God wasn't real and how would he do this? And that never occurred to me, but it may occur to others.
Yeah.
But here's the dangerous tendency to look at him and say there is this intrinsic problem all through the church life and its peoples, and you can't trust any of it.
Yeah.
And you judge the entire church by that. So
Yeah.
one of the things that we talked about earlier is we're going to talk about some of these guys, and this is where Matt and I, we don't separate, but we see different. Because you look at that and you might call these guys, these are the top dogs, the big guns, so to speak. And so what they do, you interpret the rest of Christianity in the church by what they do. And I used to do that. That was my point of my whole thing. And what I've learned through time and all this and watching people and leading what I think I interpret the kingdom as, on the bottom of that, I don't even look for that stuff anymore. If it's an issue or a circumstance that takes place in my scope and my world, I'm going to dig in it and work with it. But other than that, the question is a lot of people may not know that. Well, if you're living in your own lane, in your own place, and you go to church and you're active in your community, but you don't follow all this other muckety muck stuff, they'd go, who?
Yeah. And I think that's what we strive for. And I think that's a very mature response and position to be in. Somebody who's walked in the kingdom a long time, somebody who's been beat up. I also think there are scores and scores of people in the church at large that are not in that position.
Yeah.
They're not in a place to be able to follow the kingdom and stay in their lane, as it were, and not let the trappings of the organized church dictate and define how they view God and how they view the kingdom. And so my heart goes out to them because they're not in that space that you're in, that I'm in, maybe, about being able to continue to do what God's called us to do, continue to do what individually God wants everybody to do, which is pursue him, pursue his face and holiness, and be transformed into his image, regardless of what the organization's doing.
Yeah.
That's the goal. But I think honestly, a vast majority of the American organized church is not in that spot, is my contention.
Not in what spot?
The spot that you're in, to be able to say, I don't even look at all this
no,
stuff.
I agree with you on that.
So part of me doesn't want to even talk about it because it's not in the space where the kingdom is thriving. It's not in the space where God's called necessarily me to be, or you to be, or the individual to be. If that makes sense? But at the same time, there are scores of people out there that are out in that space, and a response to me seems appropriate. Not a response, but just an encouragement. We were talking, like I said, there's typically, I've seen two responses, and social media is what social media is, and it's an exercise in futility at best. But even in the news, we're talking about hitting the news and things like that. There's been two basic responses. Either, well, I say that two mainline responses that I've seen. On the one hand, you've got people almost but not quite defending some guys. And this was true in the Southern Baptist Convention stuff and the Catholic Church stuff and all this stuff that's kind of come out, even in some of the UPC and the UMC and all of that's come out. They're short of defending them, but saying let's keep it in, and that's what's been happening. We've been keeping it in house. It's not, we don't want to get everybody involved. This is church business. The other side of that is burn the church down.
Yeah.
It's all bad. Everything's rotten to the core. And I think both of those responses are inappropriate. And I guess my call today and what I kind of wanted to dig through today was not, all right, let's try to define Robert Morris's character. There's no way we can do that. I don't know the guy. I know that the allegations that were made against him have been verified by his church. I watched one of their elders speak, and my heart goes out to that guy that had to stand up in front of 100,000 people in person and online and take his lumps for some of the things that had happened and knowing some things. And it's just terrible. But in answer to the question, how did we get here? Where this, I think, crosses what Tim and I talk about and where we are in ministry is, guys, we pound the table almost weekly about not defining the kingdom by what we think the kingdom is supposed to look like. I mean, y'all hear us say that all the time, to the point that sometimes our spouses are like, do y'all have any new topics today? Or y'all just talking about what the kingdom's supposed to look like and not supposed to look like? And I'm like, no, that's it. That's pretty much all we got. We got like 3 bullets in our belt, and that's one of the big ones. But the reason that's important to me, Tim, is because when we build the church the way we think it should work and we start elevating celebrity pastors, even the mega church model has got its own problems. It's not good, bad, or ugly, but it's got traps in it you got to be careful about and all these things. But when we build this idea of, all right, who's important? Well, if you got a lot of followers and you pastor a big church, those are the guys we got to protect. Those are the ones. We've got a structure that we've built around the kingdom of God, the church of God, that we designed. This is our Tower of Babel.
Wow, that's actually a pretty good way of articulating it.
And what gets me in this whole deal is everybody's like, how did we get here? Well, the answer to me, and you speak into this, but the answer to me is that the way we got here is because we built our own religious Tower of Babel in the organized church, specifically in the Western world, that was built for this kind of elevation and fall. When we elevate men to the place of celebrity that we've done, and we've built a system that brings it. I heard a lady on a podcast yesterday who just graduated from Dallas Theological Seminary. And she said at her orientation, they show you this big video about how great the school is and here's what you're going to be involved in. And they bring all of these people through to give little testimonies on the video of how great Dallas Theological is. Yeah. Well, as it turns out, in hindsight, she says, looking back, it was all the big muckety mucks. Tony Evans is one of them.
Yeah.
All of the big name guys. And so from the day one that these people are going into their theological training to lead, organize, and structure the church, the bill of goods that they're being sold is that this is what it means to be successful in the kingdom of God.
Yeah.
Have a big following. Have all of this prestige, be somebody, and they don't say it that way implicitly. Not explicitly. It's an implicit assumption.
It is an implicit assumption. But the function being by men, and using this function of the church. Your church is successful, meaning that you're right with God if you have people following you and all this kind of stuff.
That's what they say.
And people watch that. Well, that's a natural response is what it is. And that's the part that I can't really articulate why we have to work that way, why were we created that way. And at the beginning of a salvation, and now you're going to work through all this sanctification for the rest of your life. That's one of the things that I think that you're going to have your natural tendencies. And I don't mean that in an evil sense.
Right.
But what God begins to work out through sanctification is so that you have to work out your kingdom nature. I don't really know what to call it. So you got your natural self, and then you got what's being developed there.
Right.
And you get to a point, we've talked about where God told Abraham, you know, you go walk before me here.
Right.
And as I looked at that, I started learning that he never really said that anywhere else.
Yeah.
Abraham's the only one he said it to. And the point being is that he told Abraham that because Abraham had some knowledge and some experience and some things going on that he should be able to walk out and start acting and walking and talking, not being God, but being able to go, well, this is the way God would take that, for lack of a better way to explain it, right? Our whole life after salvation is growing like that. Well, when we set up this Tower of Babel, like you said, I think that's an appropriate. We have built this thing. This is what it looks like. DTS is a great place to be able to put out there because it's been out there a long time. There's been a lot of, they've had, I don't know if it's tens of thousands of ministers that have come out of that place, but certainly multiple thousands. And a lot of the heavy hitters that we study went there.
Yeah.
And so it makes sense that you would go to one of their graduations or whatever it is, and you're going to hear a lot of speak about how this place is great, what it's done, look what we can show for it. And the things that they're missing is when they do that, I know individually they're going, you know, God put this in place, and they don't know how else to explain it.
Right.
But what needs to be explained is like what Paul did in Corinthians. They kept asking him all these questions. Well, if it was me, I might do this or do that, or God would do it this way. And then he comes back and he goes, none of this is relevant. It's about Christ and him crucified and the atonement that he paid for you and I to put us back in the place like we're in the garden right now.
Right.
And as you look at all of the apostles, they dealt with the individual daily things for sure, but they kept coming back to that same thing. And that's when people would check out, I think.
I do too. And
they'd go like, huh? What?
Well, and we read Paul's writings where he talks about, I've learned to have and I've learned to do without, to be abased, to be lifted up, and all these things. I can function in any of them. And we immediately, because I think a lot because we're Americans.
No,
because
it happens in the
well, no.
third
Let
world
me finish though. Our mind goes to, we immediately ascribe financial means to that.
Yeah, that's a piece.
You've learned to be what we read, that we then interpret that through the lens of our affluence and say what he's saying there is, I've learned to be rich and I've learned to be poor.
Yeah.
I've learned to be famous and I've learned to be not known. Do those apply? Certainly. I mean, but they're not only those things. What also applies to it is he's saying it just doesn't matter if I've got 3,000 people or if I'm sitting across the coffee table from a guy in his Bible. I've learned to have a big following, and it's good to not have a big following. He's saying those things as examples, and we take them as like, oh, well, that's the rule.
Because those things are not measure of a kingdom life.
No.
That's why he's saying that.
And so the question of how did we get to where we are, to me, is, I won't say it's not, I want to say it's simple. It's nuanced, but really, the reason we're in a place like this is because, first of all, we're just human. I think it's also, we got to say, these guys are just people. But for the grace of God, there go each and every one of us. What did one guy said? We're all one decision away from a completely different life.
Yeah.
And so there's that part of it to keep in mind that we lose sight of. We think that, oh, well, these guys, I remember what really started sticking out in my head years ago. I'd go to these pastors' conferences and they always have these big name guys come talk. That's the deal, you know? You got 3,000 people in your church, you get invited to speak at conferences because you obviously know what you're doing. And then you do a breakout session on how to go from 200 to 2,000 in 6 months. And that's how we've built this model. That's the Tower of Babel.
Yeah.
And we've placed these leaders in such a place that we created an environment that they could do what they did. Some of them we're not talking about just minor moral failures. There's that, but then there's also, like in the Southern Baptist Convention report and Robert Morris, we're talking egregious, illegal, abusive things. People with real victims. I mean, not that all victims are, I mean, but these are people who have been basically utterly destroyed by the shepherds that were supposed to tend them.
Yeah, and they have to watch them succeed.
And exactly right. They're watching them succeed. And but we've built a culture that has allowed for that. In some parts, in some places, and in some persuasions. It's not like that. The whole church is not like that. I've always been in small churches where it's much harder to have a culture like that because there's too much accountability, too much one-on-one personal. I know the pastor. He's sitting next to me at the ball games and either at our house. And I think that that's part of the thing here. Because the next question is what do we do about it? Well, it's not mine to do anything about. It's not yours to do anything about. I'm not on the elder board at the Gateway Church. I'm not on the elder board at Oak Cliff Bible Fellowship.
Yeah.
And so, but that doesn't mean we don't have, okay, so how do we, you mentioned it a while ago, the question in my mind becomes, how do we prevent this kind of stuff from happening? And because we live in a broken, fallen world, we're probably never going to.
Well, it ain't going to
Completely.
happen here.
That's what I mean. And so the inclination, I guess, that I think, I mean, if I'm going to speak for you, and if it's not right, correct me, that we want to push the church into is, okay, how did we get here? We got here by building man-made structures, towers of Babel, the way we thought that God wanted them to build. Our inclination now to deal with this mess that we've got is to build better and more fine-tuned structures that we think are right to prevent the mess that we created in the first place. It's the exact same thing the Jews did. God gave them 10 laws, and they built 600 and some odd to make sure that they fulfilled the 10. And then Jesus came and told them they were all vipers and dead men's bones because they did what they was right. You said it, well, don't judge, right in the side of their own eyes, but they were still building man-made structures. Now, that's not to say that we can't put safeguards in place and background checks on these people and all that. I'm not saying that. I'm talking about the spiritual health of the body of Christ. My inclination is to put in some of those structures. Oh, we got to make sure this doesn't happen and that doesn't happen and here's how you do it. But that's not really the answer either. I mean, I'm not saying practically it wouldn't help, but ultimately, what do you do about it is each individual's got to decide in their own heart, what does this and how does this impact my walk with the Lord today?
Well, that is the end of it.
Yeah.
So, as leaders, if I had a church, yes, I have a huge obligation to lead my congregation well by how I walk individually and how I treat other people and how I deal with that inside of their issues, common or not, that transpire. But somebody in my church, if I walk off the cliff and I start chasing women or I start doing something like that, should I be excommunicated out of the ministry position I hold and the authorities that I do? Yeah, probably. How all that happens, that's not really my point of saying this. But for the person who looked up to somebody and they are absolutely crushed because they had a thought or an image, and it might have been right, but they do what they do. What's happening in that is, so that's where I think we can't miss God in this thing.
Yeah. Right.
God goes into situations like that and tosses it straight up in the air. Mm-hmm. Wow, I've been caught. This is what I did, whether I knew I was wrong or I didn't know I was wrong, whatever degree it is, that's not the point. I'm talking about the one who was being led by that, might have been being led well, and they see the fallout from this individual and the sinfulness in them and what they do. And that leaves me, I look at that and I start questioning all kinds of things. You might question God. Who are you and why would you even allow something like this to happen to me? And I would tell you that's a legitimate question to ask.
Yeah.
And you might say, how could you do that? Because I really do believe in God. I'm doing these things. Man, you just really messed this up and it hurts me.
Yeah.
There's all kinds of emotions that can transpire in that kind of stuff. But in the end, that's something that transpired, and I would tell you God's hand was in it. And now you have to look him at the face and start dealing with where you stand with him in that regard.
Well, and I want to, when you say God's hand is in it, some people will interpret that as God was okay with it happening. That is not
Oh, no,
what
no,
Tim
no,
is
no,
saying.
no. That gets
I
into
know.
permissive stuff and all kinds of other
That's
things.
not what Tim is saying. But and the only reason that hit my brain is because I heard that in some other conversations this week.
Yeah,
Somebody else said God's hand was in it. God's hand is in this. Well, God didn't intend
What I meant
it.
is God tossed it up in the air and everything came to
Yes.
open. That's
Yeah.
what I meant by that.
No, exactly. And I guess for probably 2 decades at least of my 30 years of being in ministry, I've wrestled kind of being on this fence of just really seeing stuff in what I'll call the organized church, particularly the Western American church, because that's where I'm at.
Yeah.
They just really don't like. It's not comfortable, and it's not just a preference. It's like, this doesn't feel right in terms of the kingdom. And trying to rationalize those things. And we've been able over those couple of years to work out some of those. And to the point that, just to be honest, there's not a lot of places I even feel like I'm comfortable in church anymore.
Yeah.
Because there's so much in the Tower of Babel that we've built that makes me nauseous. And not from a self-righteous standpoint, it's just from a knowing in my spirit, this is not it. This is not what we're supposed to be doing. Well, what are we supposed to be doing? What do we do today? And then that dovetails into, how do we keep this from happening? Well, the short answer is men are broken, men are lost, and we've been screwing up since Adam and Eve, and we're going to keep screwing up men, women, and I mean humankind, not just men, humankind, because there's a bunch of stories about women out there doing some of this same stuff too. We're going to be broken until Jesus comes and fixes it all, ultimately. And he had the cross, we've been paid for, but he's going to set everything right completely at one point.
Yeah.
Until then, we're going to still struggle with this great gift in these dang clay pots, and we're going to struggle. And so I want to encourage people to resist the knee-jerk reaction to build more man-made stuff to deal with man-made problems. Sunday I preached on Legion, and the thing, I had a guy tell me the other night, he said, I've never looked at that story the way that you looked at it, which is, I think, is a real compliment. I took it as such.
Yeah.
But the direction that we took was those townspeople, the people of the Gerasene people, or the Gerasene people, they had a problem in Legion. He was this demon-possessed guy who was running around naked in the catacombs and causing grief and causing problems. The only thing they knew how to do was slap chains and shackles on him and try to bind him up and keep him pinned down. Well, that didn't work because he busted them all. Well, and so Jesus comes in and actually deals with the spiritual problem that is the problem. He cast out the demons. And the guy's right mind, he's clothed, he's doing fine. Well, the response the townspeople had was they asked Jesus to leave. He comes in and fixes their problem with a spiritual kingdom approach, and they didn't know what to do with it. And it even says they, out of fear, they asked him to leave. And what did he do? He says he got in the boat and he left. And he left them with it. Now he left Legion there. His name wasn't Legion. That was the name of the demon.
That was the name of the demon, but
But
he
that's the
told
only
that
name-
guy to stay there
and preach
as a witness of what
Yes.
transpired, and he didn't want to stay there.
No, he
wanted to go with Jesus.
Well, he wanted Jesus to stay with him.
Yeah.
And Jesus says, no, but you go and tell everybody. And it said, you know what it says he did? He went about the place just telling everybody what Jesus had done for him. And so, to me, the answer of what do we do now and how do we keep this from happening in the future is actually the same answer of how could we have prevented from being here in the first place? It's all the same answer. And that is what we pound the table about. And I think sometimes we do it so insistently because it's a reminder to us that that's what we've got to do individually and personally, is we've got to keep our eyes focused on God in his face. And it's not just a cliche for us. that is the answer. How could we have prevented this? Well, then every leader that have ever come through in their fallenness would have made it more important to keep their eyes on Christ than it was their ministry and their size of their ministry and their personal whatever, and gotten into whatever they got into in their mind that brought them to this other place. Because nobody gets to that place like that.
Yeah.
And I'm speaking, there's a mirror here. I'm speaking to me. All right, how do I keep from being there? How do we keep Tim from being there? The pastor you're serving under, the elders that you're serving, how do you keep their face in God's face?
Well, and if you're one of those that it's a victim, so to speak, like my example that I laid out here, and you know what, now that you're talking about, what was this cat's name for Gateway?
Robert Morris.
Robert Morris. I actually have some very good friends that are under that ministry and have been there for some time. I'm going to check on them. But my point is, you look at somebody like that and they have this big falling out, depending on where you are in your spiritual walk, you might be able to forgive that situation and overlook it. And even though they're going to deal with consequences and all that, that's how it works, right? And there's biblical precedent of that all over the place. But where sanctification works in that, and I talked about God throwing this thing up in the air, and everything comes to light. Well, it's not just coming to light on the guy that had the problem.
Yeah.
It might come to light on probably where you're standing at, right? Because you may look at that and go, I can't forgive that. There is no way. And the kingdom's looking at you going, well, let's work on that.
Yeah.
Because that is something. And you may say, I'm not going to do it. And you may not do it. But if you keep looking God in the face in other places, I'd tell you 10 or 15 years from now, you look at that and you go, man, I do forgive that. God takes all of those kind of situations and he works them inside of you until you come to a place where you just look God in the face and you say, I'm not going to do it. And you can do that.
You allow it.
Well, we have precedents of that. Jesus equipped 70 plus bodies to go out and do miracles and do these things of the kingdom and all that. It doesn't really show us that at the end, but they all left because they got to places to where they weren't going to do what the kingdom was telling them the kingdom really was, because it got outside of what they thought it should be, how it should work, how it should do all this stuff, and they couldn't reconcile that, or wouldn't. I would say they wouldn't reconcile it. Yeah. I think God brings us to a place where you're looking at him in the face, you know full well what it is,
yeah,
but you decide, nah, I don't want to do that. And now that's a whole nother conversation. Does it make God can't work with you, all that? No. That's another conversation. But the point is it's going to split two ways. When you find things that are destroying you and how you honor somebody or an institution or whatever that is, and then some ugly light shows up that's coming up out of it, that you would think there's no way that could happen, or it shouldn't happen, or whatever that is. Picture Jacob, and some shadow of a guy walks out of nowhere and starts wrestling with him, and he realizes he got a hold of, and he goes, you're the answer of everything there is, and I am not letting you go until you bless me. Mm. Well, that's the situation that you're in. God didn't cause that situation necessarily for you to have to go through that, but he'll certainly use it to help you grow yourself, and it has nothing to do with what transpired over there. Mm-hmm. That's the cool thing that I see in all this stuff, and maybe that's why when I look at situations like this now, I'm not surprised by it by any stretch of the imagination. And I can look at Gateway Church right now, don't know anything about them. Like I said, I know some people that are in there, and they got some pretty sizable ministries, and they've been influenced by that, but I know a whole lot of other ones that would like that too. And I can look at them and I can go, don't be influenced by what fell over there. Look at God in the face. Did he use this to help build you? Yeah. So don't start throwing everything out.
Well, it's like we've talked about deconstruction and deconversion.
That's exactly what can happen out of that. Yeah.
And we've talked about that before. And I historically take the stance that deconstruction is, I draw a distinction between deconstruction, which is I got to figure out what I believe and peel apart all the man-made stuff from what is real, versus deconversion, which is doing the same thing, but with the intent and the goal of finding a reason to walk away from the faith. And there are different, and I, because I believe those are
Yeah.
two different processes.
Yes.
Tearing my faith apart to make it stronger and take away all the crap, the babble stuff that we've built to find the pure nugget is a different process than peeling away everything that's good to give me a reason to blaspheme and to curse God and walk away. Those are two different things. They get punched together a lot of times because they kind of,
they
the
do.
process looks a lot the same. My encouragement to people today would be not to, don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. The Western Organized American Church. Well, there's some monikers for you, but that's a really, I feel like I should qualify that. Has the Western Organized American Church will not save you.
Yeah.
Jesus, him crucified, buried, resurrected, will save you.
Yes.
Sometimes you find him in the organized Western American church. Sometimes you find him in your small group that meets on Thursday nights at the barbecue place. Sometimes you find him on your own somewhere. And then you find a group of people to hold yourself accountable and to be in fellowship with because he designed us for that. But what I see people doing is equating the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus as that's what church is. And that's not the same thing as the organized Western church, American church. And I will even say this, I believe in the church.
Yeah.
I believe that God not only died for his people, but I also believe in the organization. The organization is helpful in advancing the kingdom of God that he brought with him when he came. I also know that it's been built by, there's what did he say? On this rock, Peter, I will do what? Build my church. Well, then we decided he wasn't doing it fast enough or quite right, and so we decided to start building along with him. It's the stuff that we built that's coming down. I said Sunday morning,
Yeah.
the scriptures tell us that one more time, he will shake the heavens and the earth. And the only thing that's going to be left is that which is eternal.
Yeah.
What we've built around God's church is not eternal.
And we may want it to be eternal.
We may want it to
think
be.
that that's how it's supposed to be eternal.
But it's
and
not.
It might have started out that way, but then God's going to shake it, and for what it is going to show up. Well,
I was watching a video the other day of a guy. It was the best video. I wish I'd have saved it because it was the best video I've ever seen of anybody threshing this chaff and getting the chaff away. Because the kernels they were getting were bright red and the chaff was brown, and you could really see it coming apart. It was really a good video. That's what's happening.
Yeah.
It's got to happen. And I would even say, and Tim, I think, will back me up on this, it happens to us on an individual level as much as it happens on a corporate level. And it actually is more important that it happened to us on
the individual level. Absolutely. That's exactly right.
That's why we go through trials. That's why we go through all this stuff. That's why he says, confess your sins before men. It's not to shame us. It's because he knows we've got to go through this process of separation from the chaff and the wheat, because it says he's coming back for a bride that is pure and ready. He's not going to come back for his bride and be like, why don't you get a shower? Because you smell like a junior high boy after recess. He's coming back for his bride, and she says she will be white and ready and pure. Well, what's that going to look like? It's going to look like him tossing us up in the air to get rid of all the crap that we've built, both in our church and in our lives.
Well, and that's, so if you're sitting here going, well, but I do go to church and I love my church family, and that is the church, as you might say. Well, you're not wrong.
Yeah.
But I would tell you that the Lord is using that to make you look at him, and you deal with him directly over things. And you know what? You might interpret some of that wrong. You might even walk into your church and say, this is how I think God says to do this. And you may get a lot of people that go, you dumb as a box of rocks, and you can't hang out with us right now. Right. They wouldn't tell you that directly, but they'd make you feel like that. But it may be flipped the other direction too. My point is all those things are available by God's hand. He is interested in you.
Yeah.
You.
And I would even go
And he'll develop all that other stuff in every one of us the same way in one form or another. But we are all distinctly different. And one of the big weaknesses of humans is to take 1,000 people, analyze what they look like, and split them into 3 groups and say, well, you're like this, or like this, or like this, or like this. And you quit looking at people as individuals the way God does.
Yeah.
And so we build these towers of Babel doing that. And we do it to ourselves. The upper's not just doing it to you. The down there is looking at the uppers and doing the same thing.
Yeah.
The point is, we do a good job of distracting ourselves from looking at God in the face and learning what that really means and what that is.
Yeah. Well, and I was telling Tim before we got on the air that part of my visceral reaction to some of this stuff is growing up in a church culture that was oddly different than our home culture. Because my home culture was extremely loving and gracious and had some rigidity to it in terms of rules and regulations, but the heart and the spirit that I grew up with was very gracious and genuine and loving. But the church environment tended not to be. The church environment tended to be that rigid, legalistic culture. It was abusive, if you wanted to use that word. It was at least oppressive. There was no freedom in Christ, no freedom in the Spirit. I was never good enough, never living up to, you could never do it right. And, good preaching was when they just lambasted you for being just the most rotten person in the world, and it had to be loud. And then that was good preaching, And it never, I just remember growing up going, that just doesn't seem like it, And so I come out of that, and even as a young preacher, as an adult, those are the guys that I would listen to and try to emulate and be like. And I look back on that and I was like, man, there's a trail of busted relationships and broken people from pursuing that. And there's a big part of me that wants to get mad about some of this stuff and be like, guys, how could you, But the truth is they could do it because they're humans and they're broken. And there's a whole lot of reasons why somebody gets to that place.
Yeah.
But it all goes back to, if we're pursuing something that we've built as a people, as a culture, as a race of humans, instead of pursuing who God is and what his nature is, it's not only possible for us to end up in these jacked up places, we're going to end up in these jacked up places.
Oh yeah.
And how do you prevent it? I just think we have a constant, compassionate call back to what Paul would call the first loves. We've got to center everything we do around Jesus Christ, him crucified, buried, resurrected, and the indwelling of the Spirit to sanctify us in our rotten crappiness. And everything else is up for debate. Theology matters. Theology only matters as far as you can get past Jesus as the Son of God, maybe the Trinity. And, I'm just saying, I'm not saying that it doesn't matter. I'm just saying, I'm just really tired of hearing people argue about it, to be real honest. And my heart's a little heavy today. I'm not even going to lie about it, just because there's some people that I know that I care for deeply. This kind of stuff hits nerves in them because they've experienced similar things, and it makes me want to go punch people in the face. But I could honestly say, you roll this clock back 25 years, and I'll guarantee there's people wanting to punch me in mine.
Oh yeah.
Just for being a jerk.
Yeah.
Not for the stuff like Robert Morris, but just for being an angry jerk.
Yeah.
And so at the end of the day, everything's redeemable. And I would even say whatever's going on, like with Tony Evans, we don't know what's going on with Tony Evans. You know what? It's none of our business either. It's his family and his eldership and his church. It's their business. It's not my business. But I know this, that the Lord is tossing him,
Oh yeah.
and the Lord's dealing with him as a son, not as
Yeah, and I would agree with that. Yeah.
and that's not to excuse
Yeah,
any
it's not an
action.
excuse.
But I mean, we'll leave. Look at the time. We'll leave with this. We talk about this a lot. I think the story of David and Bathsheba is a great one.
Mm-hmm.
He was a man after God's own heart before that, and he was a man after God's own heart after that.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean he got away from the consequence,
Yeah.
and that doesn't mean that didn't plague him the rest of his life, and that he didn't look in the mirror and write psalms like, "Who am I that you would consider me?"
Yep.
And that he didn't do all of those kinds of things. He did. And back in October, Hamas attacked Israel, and that is a direct fulfillment of the consequence of David's sin against Bathsheba.
Yep.
So there have been, I don't know how many, maybe millions of lives have been lost because of David's sin of Bathsheba.
Yeah.
Okay? So you don't get away from that. But God used David after that too, in the middle of his consequence. And so I think it's important to remember, but by the grace of God, there go each one of us.
Yeah.
Every single one of us. I want to maybe close with, if you say, well, how do we pray about it? Well, first thing I'd ask you to do is pray for the victims. Not just in this latest thing, but there's been decades and centuries of this crap. But in our time, right now, hundreds and hundreds of victims under the umbrella of the safety of the gospel of Jesus. And that infuriates me. But pray for them. Pray that they won't lose heart in who Jesus is and not define who God is by the men and the women that they've been around.
Yeah.
Then you need to pray for these people that are in trouble.
Yeah.
God loves them too. He just does.
Yeah. Even if you don't like the idea of doing it.
And I'm not going to get into it on the podcast, but I'm facing that thing right now. How do you deal with somebody that's legitimately done wrong while holding them accountable and forgiving and doing what God's called you to do as well?
Yeah.
And I don't know exactly what that looks like, but we've got to strive for it. So just to sum up the entire podcast is just keep your face in his face. Do not shut down on your faith because what we've built is crumbling.
Yeah.
Because what we've built is not eternal.
Well, and so what we built,
The organized church.
well, it may be determined with you, we pursue the character of God and accept what the character of God is. That's part of it. But some of the places where you shut down, you don't want to do it, is when you find out that God may be seeing or doing things different than how you interpret how you want him to do it.
Right.
How he's supposed to do it. And that's part of sanctification.
Right.
If you can get past that to some degree, I don't know, it takes a long time to get past there, it does for me. Then you start finding out what his true nature is, and it starts making sense out of a whole lot of other things.
Yeah.
So,
well, again, the encouragement is just keep pursuing him and don't give up on the organization.
yeah.
It's got a lot of problems, but guys, it's what we got. And it's worth salvaging. So I want to encourage you again, head out to your app store, download our app. I just realized that our Facebook Live on my profile has been private the whole time. That's probably the reason that nobody's seeing it. Nobody can see it. We'll get that fixed next time. But we love you. We appreciate you. Sorry for kind of a heavy topic today, but guys, just don't lose hope. They're just people. Love you guys. Y'all take care. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.